Okay, so I think you can see my screen, right? Somebody give me a thumbs up just to make sure.
Yep, we can see it.
All right, so we're going to talk about we're going to head to our focus topic now for today's dairy webinar, and it is going to be HPAI in dairy cattle, and we're going to talk sort of about the regulatory scheme and the measures that have been taken thus far. So this is sort of to create a record here at this point in time. Here we are about a year since the initial detection in dairy cattle nationally, not quite a year. But the evidence actually after it was discovered was that it had been present going back actually, almost a year and a half from that time. In any event, I'm going to zip through some of these slides. And again, as always, I put lots of links in the slides and encourage you to definitely get yourself a copy to explore some of these links and keep this thing around as a reference if you need it. I put all these links in a lot of times for myself because when I go back and look, then I can, access all the sort of primary sources. But, I think these are really good historical documents that capture, what's happened. And this is what's happened up to this point with regard to HPAI in dairy. Obviously, a major, major development, something none of us were foreseeing or expecting. And here we are now. So, first thing, obviously, we learned a lot of lessons about HPAI in the outbreak that occurred in 14-15 timeframe. And, obviously, that was a big one. 21 states affected, 50 million commercial birds. So that was, really, tragic, obviously, for everybody involved. But it did give sort of the processes that are involved a little bit of a experience with them and also things to change. So between the 14-15 timeframe from this earlier outbreak, USDA really got a lot of their paperwork cleaned up in a way that is very beneficial to everybody involved. Now this is the poultry outbreak. Dairy threw us a different curve. Okay, so here's the current outbreak, just in terms of where's all the data and what are the numbers. First detection, the current outbreak, of course, was in poultry, and we didn't get the knowledge that dairy was involved until, again, as we said before, about last year, about this time, was really March, and really didn't become public till April. But in any event, the bottom line is, there's 4 databases on the APHIS on the USDA APHIS website. There's the commercial poultry and backyard flocks database on the left here. There's a detection of wild birds, which is always helpful because it tells you what's coming and what are your commercial poultry getting exposed to as the birds are moving south and north at the different times of year, or just stationary and potentially transmitting. There's a detection in mammals that are not dairy cow or not, I should say, not livestock, and that's an entire set of data set that's there. And of course, this all started, probably the first detected case was a mammal. It was a seal, actually. That's why they got seals in this photo. And then there's the detections in livestock. And this is the one that is, what we're sort of here to talk about and where we are now. Now, you just want to know a little bit about how influenza and HPI gets its name and and what kind of influenza it is and all of that, and what the H's and the N's mean. This is a slide that tells you that, but the subtype of influenza A, and there are B, C, and D, but the subtype of influenza A that we're talking about that it's infected dairy cows is the H5N1 so far. So that that is the same influenza A that is been around since 2022 with the first poultry detections, but the genotype within that H5N1 is slightly different. We'll get to a graphic that I hopefully can explain that to you. And so there were, in other words, there was a mutation from the poultry HPAI that had been around since at least 2022 that enabled, dairy cattle in particular to all of a sudden start carry and transmit transmit the virus. And that mutation was quite a one-time. I'll get to a graphic on that. I don't want to blow my my best little tidbit. Okay, so the current animal totals since 2022, both poultry and dairy. There is a number of wild birds, only 12,966 wild birds. It's mostly low because the testing of the wild birds is not exactly the first priority, but it certainly is an indicator to do, but not a particularly relevant number there. 51 jurisdictions, meaning Puerto Rico is included, have bird flu and wild birds. 159 million poultry has been affected going back to the 2022 start date. This doesn't include the 50 million in 14-15 timeframe. 51 jurisdictions with outbreaks in poultry. Of course, that again includes Puerto Rico. And I believe that's the 51st jurisdiction that's being discussed there. I'm sure it is. And then this is a good one to understand. There are, as of the 12th of February, 968 individual dairy cow confirmations. And sometimes when you read this, it gets confusing because it'll say a number and it'll call those herds. It's like, no, that's individual cows. So many of these cows could have been within the same herd, so to speak. So there's not 900 herds, there's 900 and some change cows. Okay, individual states with outbreaks in dairy cows, 16. Okay, here's the map of confirmed human cases. Get everybody else wants to know about human cases and wants to talk about it. We are not going to talk about human cases, anything other than what's on this slide, just to whet everybody's curiosity. Today, there are nationally 68 human cases. And here is the breakdown up on the sort of top left of what the source of the exposure was. 41 dairy herd is the source. 23 is poultry farms and various poultry culling operations. There's one other animal exposure, which I forget what it was. I think it's wild bird, or it's backyard flocks and wild birds or something. And then there is 3 that are just unknown. Okay, so this gives you the break, sort of the layout of the country and where things stand. Obviously, Pennsylvania's clean, has not had one yet, as most of us know. California is obviously the hot seat of all of this, or has become the hot seat. And you can see the scale and the numbers and the colors and what they mean. So Washington has 11 human cases, but they are all poultry. None of them are dairy. Okay, and then Louisiana actually had the only death that has ever been seen in the U.S. From a human case, and it was a poultry sourced case, but we actually had just recently one actual death. Usually the symptoms, of course, in humans have been much milder than that. So this gives you the status of the human outbreak at this point. Not going to talk about that anymore. And again, this is only tracked since March of 2024. Okay. In other words, it doesn't go all the way back to 2022. There was, in those first couple of years of this outbreak, there were some scattered individualized cases, but the human cases really don't start in any numbers of significance until 2024. All right, now this is an interesting graphic that is really has some unbelievably insightful or enlightening, shall we say, information buried into it. Okay, Pennsylvania State vet Dr. Hamburg is the one who shared this. It came from a scholarly journal argument, and essentially all these blue lines and everything you see here, if you can see on the bottom, this goes back to, this is 2022 down here at the very beginning of this timeline that goes from left to right, and then the number of outbreaks and sort of tracing their genotype is sort of the vertical axis. Now, what this is telling us is that at this point right here, where you begin to see the red lines, or the A red line appear, that was, if you go down to the dates, that was towards the tail end of 2023. They've been able to really determine that, in fact, that is when the first dairy cow actually contracted HPAI, at least from tested samples. That's the first tested sample. That it pins it all the way back to this date right here on the timeline, which is well before, a year ago. It was the tail end of 2023. And then after that time, it's tracking the particular genotype of H5N1 that mutated and was essentially contracted by a single dairy cow back in that time. And then for the most part, all of the, well, I shouldn't say for the most part, all of the cases in cows have been essentially derived from that one. So in other words, it was one-time mutation that allowed one cow to get it, which then has spread it to all other cows that have it. That is essentially what's been proven by the genotyping of the virus that is in cows, which is quite startling. In other words, this is not a continual process where, let's say, wild birds and dairy cow are affecting each other back and forth all the time. That's not what's going on. All of these cow cases that exist now, the dairy cattle cases, all derive from that one incidence of mutation that occurred in late 2023. Now, cows, or these cows that have the virus, and I'm going to go to the next page to give you a little easier view of that portion of the graphic. They are capable and have in a very sort of infrequent way infected other animals. In other words, cows have infected other animals. That's where you see these other colors starting to appear. That's another species who's contracting this particular genotype that has been essentially otherwise completely relegated to dairy cattle. Wild birds can be in there. There's probably a little blue here and there, but it's not a situation where, again, this exposure is and transmission between what we, dairy cow, or I should say dairy cattle and wild birds, or even domestic poultry, is not something that's going back and forth all the time. This was sort of a one-time mutation, and that's what makes, things so unpredictable. And what everyone's sort of sitting on right now is this idea that there's going to be another mutation one of these days that's going to either allow this particular genotype to be more actively infected, or I should say more readily transmitted. I've got to get the right words. More readily transmitted from cows to other mammals, and in particular humans, because right now, while some of the human cases have had a dairy origin, they've been not as it's not nearly as rapidly spreading and transmitting as something like the HPAI that poultry get and how they transmit it to each other. But one mutation and the human ability to contract this genotype and for it to, become much more transmissible by humans to humans, for example, all of those things are basically a mutation or a series of mutations away, just like this dairy cow outbreak was basically one mutation away at one time. So that's a interesting and insightful way to understand all this. Now, so what are the features of this bovine outbreak? It's not as virulent as in birds. Obviously produces very relatively or comparatively milder symptoms. And I put a question mark next to full recovery, but you're generally talking about something from which there is a full recovery. Now, whether there's a permanent loss of milk production that may linger, that's something that has been kind of out there being talked about, but nothing really coming to the forefront and proven by any type of studies. So, it's not doing to cows what it's done to birds. Let's just put it that way, in terms of severity or in terms of the way it spreads amongst them. Now, obviously you're dealing with a totally different kind of animal than we've dealt with before, a high value domestic animal that not only has a value as the animal and its carcass and, all of that, but it's got this value, the future value of its milk production that is attached to it. So this is not an animal, for example, that you're going to be euthanizing due to a disease that isn't all that, significant to them. Now, if this disease somehow begins to increase in its, severity in cows, well, then that becomes a really different story and a very dangerous and scary story. Now, the other aspect of this outbreak is that this version of HPAI is essentially limited in its transmission and its care and its growth and and presence inside the cow's body to the lactation process, the production of milk and all of the organs that go into the production of milk and that is and the milk itself, and that is really why, for example, we don't see it in beef cattle. It's not that there's something biologically different. It's just that beef cattle are in different environments. And so that mutation that occurred that one time has not made its way to beef cattle. And maybe there's other biological reasons. But that essentially the explanation right now is that, removing a cow from the lactation exposure to lactation, let's just say, generally is removing it from risk, so to speak. So that's an inherent limitation on the spread. And of course, for workers, that is, that's the method of transmission, the wet, damp environment where there's aerosolized milk particles in the milking parlor and in parts of the other parts of the production areas, let's just say. And then the other part is that milk production is inherently a little less biosecure than, let's say, egg production or broiler production. Now, because you have much more distance being created by machinery and other things than you have than in the milking process and the production of milk, where you have workers touching, the cow's body on a several times a day basis. So much more possibility for spread, even with that lactation kind of focus to it. So it's harder to control from a biosecurity standpoint, and that's why, in a lot of ways, cows gave it to each other when things were starting to come out in terms of where the residue of the disease was being found. We discovered that a full almost 6 months before we ever found it, it was already infecting essentially the gene pool of cows all over the country. And that's why California is such a high rate, is because their cows had been actively sort of transmitting this to each other unknown to anyone for a long time. Okay, now let's talk about the legal authority that the federal government has. I just gave you all that information to give you sort of the basics backdrop of this disease. Okay, federal, and then we'll talk about state legal authority after that, and we'll talk about what the federal government's done and what the state government's done. And I'm doing this in a lot of ways so that you can use, your knowledge of what's going on in poultry as to compare. And, this has been a totally different effort to control this disease. And there are, very sound reasons for that. And the criticism that you get from some public health quarters is all about the human, potential here of zoonotic, transmission to humans. And that is not for our discussion today, but that's a CDC thing. That's not a USDA thing. So the criticisms really are to the CDC. Now, there's a lot of mixture in the criticisms that somehow USDA is, not doing something that they should be doing. But I think that's a much harder case. That somehow the response hasn't been appropriate, and there's reasons why it's been what it's been, and that's what we're here to talk about. Okay, federal legal authority. Obviously, we're within USDA, and it's all under APHIS, the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service, which is only one of many of the big, top branches, shall we say, of the org chart here for USDA. Interesting that marketing and regulatory programs are under the same undersecretary, that's interesting. They're related in the sense that you need clean and healthy animals to produce food and to market the food that's produced from them. So they go together in that way. But you're talking about two really different cultures there. You're talking about veterinarians versus ag marketing people. But anyway, here's the APHIS org chart then, and you have all these different subdivisions of APHIS, and this all comes down to the veterinary services end here, not so much the animal care end over here. That's not, so this is really in veterinary services. That's the portion of USDA that holds all the authority. Here is the authority. It's called the Animal Health Protection Act. It was enacted in 2002 Farm Bill, or as a wholesale reenactment, I should say, a recodification of a lot of old provisions that have been accumulated over the years. And some of these provisions go way back, turn of the century stuff, like a lot of agricultural laws that we have. We have the vestiges of some of that turn of the century or 1920s or 1930s, still very much on the books. Okay, so the overall purpose of the act is to prevent and eliminate burdens on interstate commerce and foreign commerce by various, and we'll get to it in a second, by diseases or pests. And so we'll go through that in some subsequent slides. Okay, so this is concurrent with states' intrastate authority. So you got the feds with their interstate concerns, you have the states with their intrastate concerns, and they're parallel and concurrent. Okay, states obviously depend on USDA and in this arena, for technical assistance, research, of all kinds, and money. No question about that. Again, I talked about the previous outbreak. COVID gave us a little bit of knowledge. Everybody, knows a little bit about disease transmission these days after what we've lived through. The authority in this act is extremely, extremely broad. And the act itself is actually quite short and quite brief in its text. This is some of it over here on the right-hand side. Now, the powers granted. It's powers over import, export, and interstate movement of pests, or what is regulated? Pests and disease of livestock. Pests essentially, can be, things that aren't quite diseases, like a fungus or something of that nature, are pests, is the terminology. And then how do you regulate these things as they concern import, export, and interstate? You do it through orders or regulations, and that's the two tools that they have, and they're quite broad ranging, and they have quite a lot of authority in that regard. There's very little language that limits the subject of regulations, and orders pretty much, I'll go over some of the provisions, but this is very, very broad stuff. And what is the objective necessary to prevent the introduction into or dissemination within the United States of any pest or disease of livestock? Now, so that's, in a lot of ways, that's if the regulations and the orders are found to serve that purpose, then they do not exceed the statutory authority, let's just say it in as simple way as you can. And necessary, to prevent, you can see how broad that is. It's not just a law that has a very specific scope. This is huge. Now, again, importation is the one function, and then exportation and interstate movement. Again, for the same purposes, necessary to prevent the dissemination, necessary to prevent the introduction when you're talking about interstate, or dissemination within the states. So very, that essentially gives you the focus. There's export certification is another one of the authorities. And then the enforcement authority in its broadest terms is stated this way, failure to comply with any of these orders or the regs, they have, USDA APHIS has the authority to take remedial action, destroy or remove from the United States the animal or progeny of that animal, articles or means of conveyance. And that just doesn't mean, physical, or I should say, things like equipment. Means of conveyance could certainly be a truck or something of that nature, but it's also milk. Milk is a means of conveyance of this particular disease of livestock. So, controlling milk is part of the process, and potentially even destroying, milk or ordering it to be destroyed if that's the case. And we've seen that with COVID, or excuse me, with HPAI and poultry, with the need to at times destroy eggs. Okay, now there are also seizure, quarantine, and disposal authorities, which are sort of subsumed within what kind of orders can be issued, and these are broad: seize, quarantine, treat, destroy, dispose of. You name it. It can essentially be included under there. The standard is that, first of all, it's directed towards things that need to be done with regard to moving, or I should say, things that need to be done with regard to animals, articles, or means of conveyance that are moving or have been moved in interstate commerce or has been imported or entered, the United States. And the Secretary has reason to believe may have carried, or may have been affected with or exposed to any pest or disease of livestock. That's why poultry that does not have the disease can be ordered to be destroyed, because it has been exposed to the disease in some way, shape, or form. One chicken in a house of 100,000 ends up being a sufficient exposure with regard to that extremely significant disease that essentially is a fatal disease to poultry. And of course, those other animals become the means of conveyance, the exposure to them. So concepts, those are the basic concepts that you have to apply here. Now, I'll tell you what, I'm going to skip that slide. Okay, there's compensation that can be paid for any animal, article, facility, or means of conveyance that the Secretary requires to be destroyed. Okay, makes sense. And that's been a big issue in the HPAI poultry world, is compensation for the birds that are being euthanized and potentially eggs that are lost in the process. And the eggs would be, essentially another suspected means of conveyance if they've been, produced in a facility that, has one bird, potentially even as little as one bird that has that has positive confirmation of HPAI. Okay. Oop, wait a minute. Sorry. Okay. Now, one of the things that always keep in mind with regard to, animal value is a diseased animal does not have any value. So, this is only paid for animals that are not known to be or cannot be proven to be diseased, but they needed to be put down due to their exposure. They need to be euthanized due to their exposure to the disease. Those are the animals that are compensable, not the positive testing animals. Okay, we will continue to move forward here. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover on here. Oops, wait a minute. One thing that there are exceptions, to the payment obligations for various things. Some of it is non-compliance, but this is an important provision. No payment shall be made if moved or handled by the owner in other words, the birds or whatever the objects may be, the eggs or birds or et cetera, moved or handled by the owner in violation of an agreement for the control and eradication of diseases. Well, a lot of what USDA APHIS does is by essentially agreements for the control and eradication of diseases, which are backed up by various orders, but when it comes right down to the individual premises where they may be euthanizing animals, that is generally done by an agreement that is signed between the animal owner and USDA. Okay, other powers granted. Warrantless, there are warrantless inspection powers here. There are, warrantless investigation powers granted. Now, here are the regulations for the Animal Health Protection Act. And, you can look all you want and you'll never find HPAI listed in here. There are a tiny amount of HPAI regulations, a very tiny amount, in Part 53 here, of Title IX of the CFR. And this is the beginning of that section, but none of this, of course, is applicable. There are no dairy regulations. So what regulations do exist are extremely brief, and they don't address HPAI control on bovines in any way. They strictly address domestic poultry for meat and eggs. And so the regs are no help, with regard to dairy, because we've never seen this before, and no one ever wrote any regs for it because it was not in the realm of the possibility. Another source of how USDA goes about their business under this Animal Health Protection Act is what's called the Red Books. And there are several Red Books, and there's one specifically for highly pathogenic avian influenza. What's the Red Book? The Red Book is like a statement of authority or a statement of policy, a guidance document that essentially synthesizes the statutory authority together with the manner in which USDA is going to fulfill its mission under the statute with orders, etc. And in the HPAI context, they have a little bit of regs. So this is kind of a guidance document that explains it all in very detailed and very practical means, rather than making someone read a statute book or a reg book. And in this case, and in most cases, they're not really specific because diseases are fluid. And so these red books kind of take the place, and that's why the agreements for the eradication of disease become so important, because when you get a signed agreement from the animal owner about what you're going to do about this disease in the animals and the exposure that their animals have had to it, it's just you have to save time and get in there immediately, and that's why why the USDA does agreements as opposed to orders, or prefers agreements applicable to individual premises versus orders applicable to individual premises. The orders many times are a big picture, more of an umbrella, of the regulatory authority. And when you get right down to individual premises, it's by agreements. Okay, now there are other red books, but again, here's the other ones that exist. Foot and Mouth has one, but there is nothing for HPAI and dairy cattle. Will there be someday? Perhaps. Okay, we can't utilize the poultry approach of stamp out the infected premise and go from there, because these are cows we're talking about here. Way too costly and not necessary. These are not cows whose life is in danger. Okay, again, here's a slide all about the agreements. Usually how you get agreement, let me go back. How you get cooperation with these agreements is by dangling the indemnity that will be paid, or compensation that we paid. Indemnities for animals or objects destroyed. Compensation is for the work that the farmer has put into the disease control efforts, whether it's cleaning the place, disposing of carcasses in the poultry case, whatever it may be. Now, there's no indemnity in the bovine situation. So that, at least not right now, it could be created through orders of USDA, but right now, so there's not that incentive. You don't have the financial incentive until you create it in the bovine situation. And there have been a few things. So some of the tools that normally would be available for the disease control efforts, don't really exist here in the bovine situation yet. And that's why we have what we have. I'll skip over this just to get to, okay, so the dairy cattle approach continues to evolve. And it will continue to evolve because of the absence of the things I just showed you, like a red book or regulations. And orders come as they're necessary. There wasn't any standing order of any kind because no one contemplated this. So what I have for the rest of this presentation is essentially a set of slides that show you what the federal effort has been. There was initially, it's somewhat limited. There's no question that the bovine response in terms of the legal actions taken by USDA APHIS has been relatively modest. And that's fitting to the disease, really, although there are those who say that this is looking extremely dangerous. There is probably a lot more significant disagreement over, yes, it's dangerous, but should something more be done about controlling it in dairy cattle right now? That's a very issue in dispute, shall we just call it that. So initially, there was the interstate movement order from USDA right of way, but that was just for interstate that was in April, and that was just for interstate movement, or I think it's also for export. Well, they have to have certificates of medical veterinary medical inspection for export anyway. That's this was the first step. Then there was some additional financial assistance to provide, like $2,000 per premise for supplying PPE to your employees, $5,000 per premise to develop biosecurity plans, $2,000 per affected premise per month. If you would heat treat, essentially pasteurize all the waste milk so that the virus is not going into your manure pit or in other places where the waste milk might go. You want to kill it before it goes somewhere. It is an infected, byproduct, so to speak. Veterinary cost assistance, and then $9 million was announced to essentially assist states in implementing movement restrictions. And that's the kind of financial reliance that states have with their concurrent, or that they use, and or that that they have. Let's just say they rely on federal funding to try to, because no state has is bankrolled to this extent. Okay, so that was the initial efforts. Then there was a sort of a guidance, an outline that was synthesizing all of those things and fleshing it out and clarifying it, and that was in May. Then we had the beginnings of this idea of voluntary bulk milk tank testing that would give some kind of a baseline, but it was voluntary. So you had to sign up to do it. And of course, very few people did when this was announced last May. And there was also a bunch of more emergency funding, $284 million for high path in general, and clearly the dairy outbreak had heightened those financial needs. And then we have there were some payments for milk loss in production, or lost milk production, let's just say, through what's called the ELAP program. And then there was the rollout of the National Milk Testing Strategy, which is this strategy where states would systematically come on board to create or to be tested and to hopefully achieve some type of certified clear status, shall we say. And the status is actually these words, unaffected. And so there's 4 stages of status that were created for states as they were enrolled in this program, and they began to have mandatory testing. And this shows you a map of exactly where everything stands today. 42 states are now enrolled in this program, and it was not voluntary; it was mandatory. It was just they took them states in a certain order, so that it wasn't just 50 states being looked at all at once. Pennsylvania was one of the first, and there's 3 statuses: provisionally unaffected, which means you don't have an active case in your state, but we don't really know what's behind that. What's the status of your dairy herd? Then there's unaffected, which is the gold standard status. That's saying you're as close to HPAI free in dairy as can be proven at any given time. And as you see, PA, Mississippi, and Colorado have achieved that. And that PA just achieved that recently. And that was a lot of that was due to Pennsylvania's own testing program, which Chloe talked about earlier here. Okay, so 3 states are unaffected, 41 states are provisionally affected. And so that's essentially where we are right now. I'm not sure how 41 and 3 add up to 42. That should be adding up to 44. I got to check that math. Okay, now here's the state's legal authority, and I'm sorry we're running very tight. Pennsylvania has a very parallel law called the domestic animal law. Has very similar provisions, quarantines, and the concepts of general quarantine is one of these umbrella orders that doesn't specifically apply to a particular farm, for example, but provides parameters. Special quarantine orders mean this covers a very specific location or a very specific herd or even a specific animal. So that's the Pennsylvania parallel. Let's just say there's the regulations that accompany Pennsylvania's statute. Here's the quarantine authority, and here's the list essentially of what Pennsylvania's done. First, we got in right away with, an interstate and international quarantine order that's restricted movement and required testing. And so this was, Pennsylvania's version of again, it's mandatory, just like the federal order for movement was. And then there was also a cattle exhibition order that came out very early in the thing. And then PA started its bulk milk testing program, which was a mandatory program and actually got rolled out a bit before the federal program did. And this was done by a general quarantine order, a revised general quarantine order in November from PDA. And essentially, this is the one that Chloe had the slide about, where if an in-state farm is shipping to an out-of-state plant, then the farmer themselves has to get the samples taken or allow the samples to be taken. And everything else is on essentially the processors who are coming around picking up, and their bulk tank pickups have to be all tested. And so that is done essentially on a schedule of every 2 weeks or a 14-day sort of cycle. And that's how Pennsylvania got the unaffected status so early, is that we instituted this and got it rolling so that, we actually have, a track record of clean milk supply that is literally being checked every 14 days now with the testing program that's in place. So that is our set of slides. Audrey, I will turn it back to you.
Well, I guess with that, we'll call it a day and invite everyone to visit us or come back with us next Friday, February 28th, for pesticide drift, particularly affecting organic operations, and then back for the Dairy Quarterly, April 15th, bovine disease controls, federal and Pennsylvania laws and regulations. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, or great week, and then great weekend.